My teacher butchered our names daily but had a meltdown when we mispronounced Kowalczyk after we started calling her Mrs. Kowalczyk on purpose. She failed everyone who participated until we discovered she'd been systematically giving lower grades to students with non-Anglo names for 15 years and got her teaching license revoked. I'm a junior at Lincoln High, and I have a teacher named Mrs. D. Kowalczyk who acts like she's running Harvard instead of a public school classroom. Complex name, right? Kowalczyk. Polish, with all those consonants that trip people up. She makes a huge deal whenever anyone mispronounces it, stopping class to correct them with this condescending tone. Meanwhile, she butchers student names daily without a second thought. My name is Xiomara. Yeah, it's Spanish. Xiomara. I get that it looks intimidating at first, but it's not rocket science. Xiomara. I've had her class for 2 months, and she still calls me Zmara or Xmara or whatever random combination pops into her head. I'm not the only one. There's Siobhan, who gets called Sioban instead of Shuvan. Nguyen, who she pronounces like Nujen instead of Win. Saoirse, who becomes Sorcy instead of Saoirse. But God forbid you say Mrs. Kowalczyk instead of Mrs. Kowalczyk. She'll stop mid-lecture to correct you. It's Kowalczyk, she'll say, drawing out each syllable like she's talking to a toddler. Some people just don't take the time to learn proper pronunciation. The irony was suffocating. Working with Mrs. Kowalczyk was like navigating a minefield. Every day started the same way. She'd take attendance, butchering half the names on her roster while students sat there cringing. When she got to mine, I'd feel my shoulders tense up, waiting for whatever creative mispronunciation she'd come up with that day. Zmara Rodriguez, she'd call out, not even looking up from her clipboard. It's Xiomara, I'd correct politely. Here, she'd mark me present without acknowledging the correction. Not sorry or thank you for correcting me. Just mark and move on like my actual name didn't matter. But if a substitute teacher said Mrs. Kowalczyk during morning announcements, she'd march down to the office during her planning period to set the record straight. One Tuesday morning, I'd finally had enough. She'd called me X-Omara during attendance, and when I corrected her, she actually rolled her eyes and said, "Some names are just difficult. I don't have time to master every pronunciation." That's when something clicked in my brain. If she doesn't have time to say my name right, then I don't have time to say hers right either. I waited until she called on me to answer a question about the Revolutionary War. I raised my hand and she pointed at me with that laser pointer. "Yes, Mrs. Kowalczyk," I said, pronouncing her name like I was sounding it out for the first time. Her head snapped up from her notes. "It's Kowalczyk." "Right, sorry, Mrs. Kowalczyk," I said, like I was really trying but just couldn't get it. A few students snickered. She gave me a sharp look but continued with the lesson. The next day, when she called on me again, I did it again. "Mrs. Kowalczyk, I think the answer is taxation without representation." "Kowalczyk," she corrected tersely. "Got it, Mrs. Kowalczyk." By the third day, other students started catching on. Siobhan raised her hand and asked, "Mrs. Kowalczyk, can you repeat the question?" Nguyen chimed in with Mrs. Kowalczyk when answering about the Boston Tea Party. Saoirse went with Mrs. Kowalski like she was genuinely confused about the spelling. We got creative with it. Someone used Mrs. Kowalczyk. Another tried Mrs. Kowalczyk. My personal favorite was when Marcus, whose name she pronounced perfectly fine, asked Mrs. Kowalczykowski, "Is this going to be on the test?" By Friday, Mrs. Kowalczyk was visibly twitching every time someone said her name. Her corrections were getting sharper, her voice more strained, but she couldn't really call us out without looking petty, because we were all trying, and some names are just difficult, right? The breaking point came during 5th period on Monday. We were discussing the Constitutional Convention when she called on me again, mispronouncing my name as Zara this time, not even close to any version of Xiomara. "Yes, Mrs. Kowalczyk," I responded, really drawing out the confusion. That's when she snapped. "It's Kowalczyk," she shouted, slamming her hand on the desk. Kowalczyk. How hard is that? It's disrespectful to deliberately mispronounce someone's name. You're doing this on purpose. The classroom went dead silent. 28 pairs of eyes stared at her as the echoes of her outburst faded. I looked at her calmly. "Some names are just difficult, Mrs. Kowalczyk. I don't have time to master every pronunciation." Her face went from red to purple. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it, then opened it again. Nothing came out. Siobhan raised her hand. "Mrs. Kowalczyk, are you saying it's disrespectful to mispronounce names on purpose?" "Of course it is," she snapped. "Interesting," Nguyen said quietly, "because you've been calling me Nujen for 2 months, even though I've corrected you multiple times. It's Win. And you call me Sioban," Siobhan added. "It's Shuvan." "My name is Xiomara," I said. "Not Zmara, not Xmara, not Zara, Xiomara." The room was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking. Mrs. Kowalczyk looked around at all of us, realizing she'd walked straight into her own trap. That's different," she stammered. "Your names they're from other languages." "So is yours," Marcus pointed out. "Kowalczyk is Polish, right? Should we just call you Mrs. Smith because Polish names are hard?" She stood there for a full 10 seconds, mouth opening and closing like a fish. Finally, she sat down at her desk and picked up her attendance sheet. X-Omara. That was when I snapped. My voice cracked on the word snapped, but I kept going. The whole class watched as I stood up from my desk, my hands trembling slightly. Mrs. Kowalczyk's face had gone from purple to white, her knuckles gripping the edge of her desk. I walked to the front of the room, each step deliberate. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Someone's pencil rolled off a desk and clattered to the floor, but nobody moved to pick it up. I stopped directly in front of her desk, maintaining eye contact. Mrs. Kowalczyk stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the linoleum. We faced each other across her desk, the attendance sheet between us like a battle line. Her laser pointer lay forgotten next to her coffee mug. The bell rang, sharp and sudden. Nobody moved. 28 students sat frozen in their seats, backpacks untouched, eyes darting between us. The hallway outside filled with the sounds of students rushing to their next classes, but our classroom remained a bubble of tension. Mrs. Kowalczyk's hand moved toward the attendance sheet. I watched her fingers hover over my name, over the crossed-out attempts at pronunciation she'd scribbled in the margins. Zmara, Xmara, Zara, everything but Xiomara. She picked up her red pen. The cap came off with a small pop that seemed to echo in the silent room. She drew a line through all her previous attempts and wrote in careful letters, C-O-Mah-Ra. Then she looked up at me. Her jaw worked like she was chewing on words she couldn't quite spit out. Finally, she managed a single nod. I turned and walked back to my desk, collected my things, and headed for the door. The other students began to stir, slowly gathering their belongings. As I reached the threshold, I heard Siobhan's chair scrape back. The hallway was nearly empty by the time I emerged. I leaned against the lockers, my heart still racing. Through the classroom door, I could hear the shuffle of students leaving, the zip of backpacks, the quiet murmur of voices. Siobhan came out first, her red hair catching the light. She gave me a small smile and a thumbs up before heading to her next class. Nguyen followed, pausing to bump his fist against mine. One by one, my classmates filed out, each acknowledging what had just happened with a nod, a smile, or a quiet word of support. Mrs. Kowalczyk emerged last. She walked past me without a word, her heels clicking against the floor with less authority than usual. Her shoulders were rigid, her briefcase clutched tightly in her hand. That afternoon, I sat in the cafeteria with my usual lunch group. The story had already spread through the junior class like wildfire. People I'd never spoken to before stopped by our table to share their own stories about Mrs. Kowalczyk mispronouncing their names. My phone buzzed, a text from my mom asking how my day was going. I stared at the screen, unsure how to explain what had happened. How do you tell your mother that you just staged a classroom rebellion over pronunciation? The next morning, I walked into Mrs. Kowalczyk's classroom with a knot in my stomach. She stood at the board, writing out the day's objectives in her neat cursive: Constitutional Convention, Federalist Papers, the usual AP history material. Other students filtered in, the atmosphere noticeably different from our usual morning energy. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen when she took attendance. Mrs. Kowalczyk picked up her clipboard at exactly 8:15, just like always. She cleared her throat and began calling names. When she reached mine, she paused. The entire class leaned forward slightly. Xiomara Rodriguez? She pronounced it perfectly. C-O-Mah-Ra, clear as a bell. Here, I responded, trying to keep the surprise out of my voice. She continued down the list. Siobhan O'Brien? Shuvan. Perfect. Nguyen Tran? Win. Correct. Saoirse Murphy? Searshaw. Not a single mistake. The class exchanged glances. Marcus raised his hand when she finished. Mrs. Kowalczyk, did you practice our names? Her face tightened, but she didn't snap. Instead, she set down the clipboard and folded her hands. I realized yesterday that I had been inconsistent in my expectations. If I demand proper pronunciation of my name, I should extend the same courtesy to my students. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was something. I wonder what Mrs. Kowalczyk spent her evening doing after that showdown. Did she sit at home practicing all those names she'd been butchering for months? There's something curious about how she couldn't even attempt a real apology today. We moved on to the lesson, discussing the debates between Federalists and anti-Federalists. The tension in the room gradually eased, though it never quite returned to normal. Over the next few days, things settled into a new rhythm. Mrs. Kowalczyk pronounced our names correctly. We pronounced hers correctly. It should have been the end of it, but I started noticing things, little things at first. When she returned our essays on the Constitutional Convention, mine came back with more red ink than usual. Comments like unclear thesis and needs stronger evidence peppered the margins. I'd never gotten below a B+ in her class before. This paper, C+. I compared notes with Siobhan after class. Her essay, which she admitted she'd rushed the night before, got a B. Marcus, who'd literally copied half his arguments from Wikipedia, got a B+. But those of us who'd participated in the name pronunciation rebellion, we all saw our grades drop. My mom noticed when I brought home my progress report, a C+ in AP history. Xiomara, what's going on? You love history. I explained about the essay, leaving out the classroom confrontation. She frowned at the paper, reading through Mrs. Kowalczyk's comments. These seem pretty harsh. Have you talked to her about it? The thought of approaching Mrs. Kowalczyk for a one-on-one conversation made my stomach churn. But my mom was right. I needed to address this directly. I stayed after class the next day. Mrs. Kowalczyk sat at her desk, grading papers with sharp, efficient strokes of her red pen. She didn't look up when I approached. Mrs. Kowalczyk, I wanted to discuss my Constitutional Convention essay. She glanced up briefly, then returned to her grading. What about it? I feel like the grade doesn't reflect the quality of my work. I've never received below a B+ in your class, and I put a lot of effort into this essay. Effort doesn't equal quality, Xiomara. She pronounced my name correctly, but her tone was ice cold. Your analysis was superficial, and your arguments lacked sophistication. I placed my essay on her desk, next to Marcus's, which she'd been grading. Even upside down, I could see he'd written John Locke as John Locke throughout his paper. She'd circled it once with SP, but hadn't deducted points. Could you give me specific examples of where my analysis was superficial? She set down her pen with deliberate precision. Are you questioning my professional judgment? I'm trying to understand how to improve. Perhaps if you spent less time orchestrating classroom disruptions and more time on your studies, your work would improve naturally. There it was. The real issue laid bare. This wasn't about my essay quality. This was payback. So this is about what happened with the names? I have no idea what you're talking about. She picked up her pen again. If you have concerns about your grade, you can take it up with the department chair. Otherwise, I have work to do. I left her classroom with my essay clutched in my hand, anger burning in my chest. In the hallway, I nearly collided with Nguyen. Hey, you okay? He noticed my expression. I showed him my essay grade. He winced and pulled out his own paper. C-. She's doing it to all of us. Siobhan got a C too. Everyone who corrected her about our names. This is grade retaliation. Yeah, but how do we prove it? She's careful. The comments look legitimate if you don't know the pattern. He was right. Mrs. Kowalczyk was too smart to make it obvious. She'd found a way to punish us that looked completely professional on the surface. That night, I spread out all my returned assignments from her class on my bedroom floor. Tests, quizzes, essays, homework. I photographed everything, creating a timeline. My grades before the name incident, A's and B+, after, C's and D's. I texted the others from from class, asking them to do the same. By the next morning, we had documented evidence from 8 students showing the same pattern, grades dropping immediately after the confrontation. But documentation was one thing. Getting someone to take it seriously was another. I decided to start with my guidance counselor, Mr. Peterson. He listened patiently as I explained the situation, showing him the grade patterns on my phone. Have you considered that maybe you're not putting in the same effort as before? He suggested. Sometimes when we have conflicts with teachers, it affects our performance. My effort hasn't changed. Look at my grades in other classes. All A's and B's. It's only Mrs. Kowalczyk's class. Personality conflicts happen, Xiomara. Maybe you should focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on the past. I left his office frustrated. He hadn't even looked at the evidence properly, just dismissed it as a personality conflict. Over lunch, our group strategized. Saoirse suggested talking to our parents as a united front. Nguyen thought we should go directly to the principal. Siobhan wanted to document everything for the rest of the semester before taking action. She's being more careful now, Siobhan pointed out. Yesterday she called on me in class, and when I gave the right answer, she actually had to acknowledge it. She's not going to slip up easily. She was right. Mrs. Kowalczyk had adjusted her tactics. She called on us less frequently, but when she did, she couldn't mark us wrong if we gave correct answers. The grade sabotage was subtle, subjective, hidden in essay grades and participation scores where she had more discretion. My parents noticed my stress at dinner. I'd been pushing food around my plate, lost in thought about how to handle the situation. You've been quiet lately, Miha, my dad said. Everything okay at school? I finally told them everything. The name mispronunciations, the confrontation, the grade retaliation. My mom's expression grew increasingly concerned as I showed them the evidence we'd collected. This is serious, she said. A teacher using grades as punishment? That's completely inappropriate. Mr. Peterson thinks it's just a personality conflict. My dad's jaw tightened. Then we go over his head. This is affecting your college applications. We're not letting some petty teacher ruin your future. But even with my parents' support, I knew this wouldn't be easy. Mrs. Kowalczyk had been teaching for 15 years. She was department vice chair. She knew how to work the system. The next few weeks became a careful dance. In class, Mrs. Kowalczyk maintained perfect professionalism. She pronounced our names correctly, called on us occasionally, and taught her lessons with the same efficiency as always. But the grades told a different story. My next essay came back with a D+. The comments were extensive and harsh, lacks critical thinking, superficial understanding of historical context. Writing needs significant improvement. I knew my writing hadn't suddenly deteriorated. My English teacher had just praised my analytical essay on The Great Gatsby. My history research paper for Mr. Chen's elective got an A. But in Mrs. Kowalczyk's class, I apparently couldn't write a coherent paragraph. The stress started affecting other areas of my life. I spent hours revising assignments for her class, trying to make them criticism-proof. My other grades began to slip as I devoted more time to history. I wasn't sleeping well, lying awake, replaying interactions, and planning how to fix this. One afternoon, while studying in the library, I overheard 2 sophomores talking about Mrs. Kowalczyk. She keeps calling me Alexandra when my name is Alejandra, one girl said. I've corrected her like 10 times. Just give up, her friend advised. She called my brother Mitchell instead of Miguel for an entire year. He said it wasn't worth fighting. I realized this had been going on for years. How many students had just accepted the mispronunciations? How many had been too intimidated to speak up? That evening, I created a shared document titled Name Pronunciation Experiences with Mrs. K. I sent the link to a few trusted friends, asking them to share it quietly with anyone who'd had similar experiences. Within 2 days, the document had over 30 entries. Students from different years, different classes, all sharing stories of Mrs. Kowalczyk butchering their names while demanding perfect pronunciation of hers. Some mentioned grade drops after correcting her. Others talked about feeling invisible, their identities erased every morning during attendance. The document became our ammunition, but I knew we needed more than stories. We needed a plan that would force the administration to take notice without giving Mrs. Kowalczyk room to retaliate further. That's when Siobhan had an idea that would change everything. Siobhan's idea came during our study session in the library's back corner. She pulled out her phone and showed us the school district's website, specifically the page about educational equity policies. Her finger traced across the screen as she highlighted specific phrases about cultural sensitivity and fair treatment of all students. I watched her navigate through the policy documents, my mind racing with possibilities. The others leaned in closer, and I noticed how the afternoon light caught the determination in everyone's eyes. This wasn't just about grades anymore. This was about respect. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Mrs. Kowalczyk announced a major research project worth 30% of our final grade. She distributed the assignment sheets with her usual efficiency, but I noticed something immediately. The topics she'd assigned weren't random. Those of us who'd participated in the name pronunciation protest got the most obscure, difficult subjects. I'd been assigned the role of minor Polish nobility in 17th century trade relations. Siobhan got Irish monastic influence on medieval manuscript illumination. Nguyen's topic involved Vietnamese court ceremonies during the Nguyen dynasty. Mrs. Kowalczyk assigning Polish nobility research to Xiomara feels pretty pointed, doesn't it? Makes me wonder if she picked these topics late at night, carefully matching each difficult student with something from their supposed heritage. Meanwhile, Marcus and others who hadn't challenged her received straightforward topics like causes of the American Revolution or the Industrial Revolution's impact on urban life. The message was clear. She was setting us up to fail. I spent that evening at the public library, searching desperately for sources on Polish nobility. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, noticed my frustration and offered to help. When I explained my topic, she frowned and checked her database. After 20 minutes of searching, she found exactly 3 relevant sources, 2 in Polish. My phone buzzed with messages from the others experiencing similar problems. Saoirse had found only 1 book on her assigned topic, and it was checked out. Nguyen discovered his topic was so specialized that even university libraries had limited resources. The situation escalated escalated when Mrs. Kowalczyk announced that all sources had to be from physical books, not online databases. She claimed this would teach us proper research methods, but we all knew the real reason. She was making it impossible for us to complete the assignment properly. That weekend, my parents drove me to 3 different libraries searching for materials. My dad's frustration grew with each failed attempt. My mom started making calls to university libraries, trying to arrange access for a high school student. The stress in our house was palpable. During this time, more students began adding their stories to our shared document. A former student named David messaged me privately, sharing how Mrs. Kowalczyk had sabotaged his college recommendation letter after he'd corrected her pronunciation of his last name, Okonkwo. He'd lost his spot at his dream school because of her vindictive letter. I started documenting everything meticulously. Every interaction, every assignment, every grade. I created spreadsheets comparing assignment difficulties, photographed all returned work, and kept detailed notes of classroom incidents. The evidence was mounting, but I needed something more concrete. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mr. Chen, my history elective teacher, pulled me aside after class. He'd noticed my stress and asked if everything was all right. When I hesitated, he mentioned that other students had seemed troubled lately too. I took a risk and showed him our documentation. His expression grew increasingly serious as he scrolled through the evidence. He asked for permission to review some of the graded assignments, comparing them to work from his class. After careful examination, he agreed that the grading seemed unusually harsh and inconsistent with my demonstrated abilities. Mrs. Kowalczyk's next move caught us off guard. She announced a surprise in-class essay that would count as a test grade. The topic she wrote on the board was complex and required specific knowledge from readings she'd assigned just the night before. Several students hadn't even received the email with the reading materials. I wrote frantically, trying to construct coherent arguments despite the impossible circumstances. Around me, I could see others struggling too. Siobhan's hand cramped from writing so fast. Nguyen kept checking the clock, anxiety evident in his rigid posture. When time was called, Mrs. Kowalczyk collected our essays with a satisfied expression. As she passed my desk, she paused and made a show of glancing at my paper. Her slight smirk told me everything I needed to know about how she planned to grade it. The essays came back 3 days later. D-. The red ink was so extensive it looked like my paper had been bleeding. Her comments were brutal and in many cases contradictory. She marked points off for not citing sources we hadn't been given time to read properly. That afternoon, something shifted in our group dynamic. We weren't just collecting evidence anymore. We were planning action. Siobhan had been researching the school board's complaint procedures. Nguyen had found contact information for the district's equity coordinator. Saoirse discovered that parent complaints carried more weight when submitted collectively. I organized a meeting at my house that weekend. 8 students showed up, along with several parents who'd grown concerned about their children's sudden grade drops. My living room became a war room of sorts, with laptops, printed evidence, and policy documents spread across every surface. My mom took charge of organizing the parents. She created a timeline showing how the grades had dropped immediately after the name pronunciation incident. My dad used his accounting skills to create graphs that made the pattern undeniable. Other parents contributed their expertise, building a case that would be hard to dismiss. Mrs. Kowalczyk must have sensed something was brewing. Her behavior in class became increasingly erratic. She started making snide comments about students who think they know better than their teachers, and the importance of respecting authority. During one particularly tense class, she spent 10 minutes lecturing about how some cultures didn't value education properly. The comment was so inappropriate that even students who'd stayed neutral began to shift their sympathy toward us. Marcus, who'd initially benefited from staying quiet, approached me after class to share his own documentation. He'd been tracking her comments and behavior, disturbed by what he was witnessing. Our research project deadline approached like a storm cloud. Despite my best efforts, I'd managed to cobble together only 5 sources for my paper, 3 of which barely related to my assigned topic. The paper I submitted was far below my usual standard, not for lack of trying, but due to the impossible constraints. While waiting for those grades, another incident occurred. During a parent-teacher conference night, Mrs. Kowalczyk told Nguyen's parents that their son was struggling with American educational standards and suggested he might benefit from remedial English support. This was particularly insulting given that Nguyen was born in California and spoke perfect English. Nguyen's parents were furious. His mother, a pediatrician, and his father, an engineer, had never encountered such blatant discrimination in their professional lives. They immediately joined our growing coalition of concerned families. The research papers came back with predictable results. Mrs. Kowalczyk had written a full page of comments on mine, criticizing everything from my source selection, as if I'd had any choice, to my failure to grasp basic historical concepts. She'd even deducted points for formatting issues that didn't exist. That evening, I sat at my desk staring at the failing grade, feeling a mix of anger and desperation. My GPA was plummeting. My class rank was dropping. Everything I'd worked for over 3 years was being destroyed by one vindictive teacher. My parents found me there an hour later, still staring at the paper. My mom wrapped her arms around me while my dad's jaw clenched with barely controlled anger. They promised we'd fight this, that we wouldn't let her get away with it. The next phase of our plan required careful coordination. We needed to present our case to the administration in a way that couldn't be dismissed as teenage complaints or parental overreaction. Siobhan's mother, a paralegal, helped us organize our evidence into a professional presentation. We also discovered that Mrs. Kowalczyk had a pattern. Former students started reaching out after hearing about our situation through older siblings or friends. Stories poured in about years of similar behavior, always targeting students with difficult names, always using grades as weapons. One particularly damaging story came from a student named Aisha, who'd graduated 2 years prior. She'd been accepted to Columbia University, but Mrs. Kowalczyk's last-minute grade change had caused her to lose her valedictorian status, and with it, a crucial scholarship. Aisha had to attend a state school instead, her dreams derailed by petty vindictiveness. As we compiled these stories, days, a clear pattern emerged. Mrs. Kowalczyk had been systematically discriminating against students with non-Anglo names for years, using her position and reputation to avoid consequences. The administration had apparently received complaints before, but dismissed them as isolated incidents. Our coalition grew to include 15 current students and 12 families. We had testimonies from 22 former students. The evidence packet we'd assembled was over 50 pages long, meticulously organized, and impossible to ignore. The principal finally agreed to meet with a representative group of parents. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. We spent the weekend preparing, rehearsing key points, and organizing our presentation. I barely slept, running through scenarios in my mind. Monday's class with Mrs. Kowalczyk was tense beyond description. She seemed to know something was happening. Her usual commanding presence was replaced with a nervous energy. She stumbled over her words during the lecture and snapped at students for minor infractions. When she called on me, her voice had an edge of challenge. I answered her question correctly, citing specific dates and events. She couldn't fault my response, but her expression suggested she wanted to. The power dynamic in the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. After class, she asked me to stay behind. My heart raced, but I remained calm. She stood behind her desk, fingers drumming against the surface. For a moment, we simply looked at each other, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. She opened her mouth several times before finally speaking. Her words were careful, measured. She mentioned how my recent work hadn't met her standards, how college recommendations required honest assessment of student capabilities. The threat was clear: back down or face further consequences. I left without responding, but my hands shook as I walked to my next class. This is getting so intense. The way Mrs. Kowalczyk tried to scare her at the end with that threat about college recommendations made my heart race. She was escalating, becoming desperate. The meeting with the principal was tomorrow, and she knew her carefully constructed world of control was cracking. That night, our group chat buzzed with activity. Everyone was nervous but determined. Parents shared words of encouragement. Students double-checked their documentation. We were ready, but the outcome remained uncertain. The morning of the meeting arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood. I sat through my morning classes unable to focus, watching the clock inch toward the scheduled meeting time. Mrs. Kowalczyk's class was my last period before the meeting, a scheduling coincidence that felt like torture. She conducted class as if nothing was wrong, but I noticed her checking her phone repeatedly. Her teaching was mechanical, going through the motions without her usual passion. When the bell rang, she dismissed us without her customary homework reminder. I met my parents outside the principal's office. Other families were already gathered, faces showing a mix of determination and anxiety. Siobhan's mother had prepared folders for each participant, containing key evidence and talking points. Inside the conference room, we found Principal Williams, Assistant Principal Martinez, and unexpectedly, the district's Director of Equity and Inclusion, Dr. Patricia Thompson. Her presence suggested our complaint had already attracted attention at higher levels. The meeting began with my mother presenting our timeline. She spoke clearly and professionally, letting the evidence speak for itself. Other parents added their testimonies, sharing how their children had been affected. The administrators listened intently, occasionally exchanging glances as particularly damaging evidence was presented. When Dr. Thompson asked for specific examples of discriminatory behavior, we were ready. Parent after parent shared stories of mispronounced names, dismissive comments about cultural backgrounds, and most damningly, the clear pattern of grade retaliation. Principal Williams tried to suggest these might be isolated misunderstandings, but the sheer volume of evidence made that position untenable. When we presented the testimonies from former students, including Aisha's story about losing her Columbia scholarship, Dr. Thompson's expression hardened. The meeting stretched for 2 hours. By the end, the administrators had agreed to launch a formal investigation. They would review all of Mrs. Kowalczyk's grading from the past semester and interview affected students. Dr. Thompson personally assured us that the matter would be taken seriously. As we filed out of the conference room, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. We'd been heard, but what would happen next remained uncertain. Mrs. Kowalczyk still controlled our grades, and the investigation would take time. The next few days were surreal. Mrs. Kowalczyk continued teaching, but her demeanor had changed completely. Gone was the commanding presence and cutting remarks. She taught mechanically, avoided calling on any of us, and left immediately after class. Other teachers began to notice the tension. Mr. Chen pulled me aside to offer support, mentioning that several faculty members were aware of the situation and monitoring it closely. It seemed Mrs. Kowalczyk's reputation among her colleagues wasn't as sterling as she'd projected. Then came the announcement that shook everything up. Principal Williams called a special assembly for all juniors. As we filed into the auditorium, speculation ran wild. When Dr. Thompson appeared on stage alongside the principal, my heart began racing. The announcement was carefully worded but clear in its implications. The district was implementing new oversight measures for grading practices. All teachers would undergo cultural sensitivity training. A new review process would be established for grade disputes. While Mrs. Kowalczyk wasn't named, everyone knew why these changes were happening. The investigation continued behind the scenes. Students were called in for interviews. Our documented evidence was reviewed by district officials. Mrs. Kowalczyk's past grade books were examined, revealing years of similar patterns. During this time, she became increasingly isolated. Teachers who once chatted with her in the hallways now offered only polite nods. Her classroom, once a domain of absolute control, felt hollow. She still taught, but the authority she'd wielded like a weapon had evaporated. 3 weeks after our initial meeting, the hammer finally fell. We arrived at school to find a substitute teacher in Mrs. Kowalczyk's classroom. An email from Principal Williams informed us that she was on administrative leave pending the completion of the investigation. The substitute, Ms. Rivera, was young and energetic. She immediately won us over by taking time to learn everyone's name correctly, even practicing pronunciations until she got them right. The contrast was stark and healing. Our grades from Mrs. Kowalczyk's class were frozen pending review. A committee was formed to reevaluate all assignments from the semester. Mr. Chen was part of this committee, which gave us confidence in a fair outcome. As the review progressed, the full extent of Mrs. Kowalczyk's discrimination became clear. The committee found that students with non-Anglo names averaged a full letter grade lower than their peers, even when controlling for other factors. The pattern stretched back years. The district's final report was damning. It documented systematic discrimination, abuse of power, and violation of multiple district policies. Mrs. Kowalczyk was terminated from her position. More importantly, all affected students would have their grades reviewed and adjusted based on fair evaluation standards. When the revised grades were released, my D's and F's had become B's and A's. My GPA recovered. My class rank was restored. The damage to my academic record was repaired, though the emotional impact lingered. But the victory felt bigger than grades. We'd stood up to someone who'd used their power to diminish us, to erase our identities one mispronounced name at a time. We'd proved that our names mattered, that we mattered. The district implemented permanent changes based on our case. Teachers now had to complete pronunciation guides for all student names at the beginning of each semester. Cultural competency became a mandatory part of professional development. A clear process for reporting discrimination was established. Siobhan's idea to check the district policies had started it all, but it was our collective action that created real change. We'd learned that standing up to authority was scary but necessary, that documentation and persistence could overcome even entrenched power. As I sat in Ms. Rivera's class, listening to her correctly pronounce every name during attendance, I thought about all the future students who wouldn't have to endure what we did. They wouldn't have to choose between their identity and their grades. They wouldn't have to accept disrespect as the price of education. The shared document we'd created became something of a legend, passed down to younger students as both a cautionary tale and a blueprint for action. It reminded everyone that no one should have to tolerate discrimination, no matter how powerful the perpetrator seems. Mrs. Kowalczyk never returned to Lincoln High. Rumors circulated about her attempting to find work at other districts, but her termination for discrimination followed her. The woman who'd insisted on perfect pronunciation of her own name while butchering others had finally faced consequences. Our group remained close through the rest of junior year. We'd been forged into a team by adversity, and those bonds didn't break easily. When college acceptance letters arrived senior year, we celebrated each other's successes, knowing we'd almost lost these opportunities to one person's prejudice. Looking back, I realized the most important lesson wasn't about grades or college applications. It was about the power of community, the importance of documentation, and the courage required to challenge injustice. Mrs. Kowalczyk had taught us something valuable after all, just not what she'd intended. Our names carried our histories, our cultures, our identities. They deserved to be spoken correctly, with respect and care. That simple act of human dignity had been too much for her to grant, and ultimately, it had been her downfall. The following week brought a new challenge I hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Kowalczyk returned to school, not to teach, but to clear out her classroom. I spotted her car in the parking lot during lunch and felt my stomach drop. Word spread quickly through our group chat. Everyone was on edge, wondering if she'd try something desperate. I watched from the library window as she made multiple trips between the building and her car, carrying boxes of personal items. Her movements were stiff, mechanical. Other teachers gave her a wide berth in the hallway. Nobody offered to help. During sixth period, I needed to use the restroom and had to pass by her old classroom. The door stood open. Inside, she was pulling posters off the walls, each one making a harsh ripping sound. Her desk sat empty except for a cardboard box half filled with picture frames and coffee mugs. She must have sensed my presence because she turned around. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Her face looked different without its usual stern expression. Older, tired. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then turned back to her packing without a word. I hurried past, my heart racing. Part of me had expected some final confrontation, but the reality was more unsettling. She looked defeated, reduced to clearing out 15 years of teaching materials in silence. That evening, my mom asked if I'd heard about Mrs. Kowalczyk's return. The parent network had been buzzing with updates all day. Some worried she might try to cause problems. Others felt satisfied seeing consequences finally catch up with her. So Mrs. K went from terror of the classroom to basically the ghost of teaching past, haunting the halls while everyone pretends not to see her. That's a pretty crazy career plot twist right there. I couldn't shake the image of her alone in that classroom, dismantling her career one poster at a time. Yes, she'd hurt us. Yes, she deserved to face consequences. But watching someone's professional life crumble still felt heavy. The next morning brought more developments. Principal Williams sent an email announcing that interviews for Mrs. Kowalczyk's replacement would begin immediately. They wanted someone in place before the semester ended to ensure continuity for AP exam preparation. Ms. Rivera continued substituting in the meantime. She'd transformed the classroom atmosphere completely. Students actually participated in discussions now. People raised their hands without fear of being humiliated. The room felt lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted. During lunch, Siobhan showed me something on her phone. Someone had posted in a teacher's forum about a position at Lincoln High, warning about the discrimination scandal that led to the previous teacher's termination. The comment section was brutal. Word had spread beyond our district. I realized Mrs. Kowalczyk's teaching career was effectively over. No school would hire someone terminated for systematic discrimination. 15 years of experience meant nothing when weighed against documented prejudice. Our grade review committee continued meeting twice a week. Mr. Chen kept us updated on their progress. They'd expanded their investigation to include Mrs. Kowalczyk's previous years, identifying dozens more affected students. The scope kept growing. One afternoon, while working on college applications, I got an unexpected email. Aisha, the former student who'd lost her Columbia scholarship, wanted to talk. She'd heard about our successful challenge and felt a mix of pride and regret. We video chatted that evening. She looked tired but determined, now in her second year at state school. She shared more details about how Mrs. Kowalczyk's last-minute grade change had derailed her plans. The scholarship she'd lost was need-based. Without it, Columbia became financially impossible. Aisha had considered fighting back at the time but felt powerless. clueless. Her parents were immigrants who trusted the system. They'd assumed the teacher must have had valid reasons. By the time she realized the pattern of discrimination, it was too late. Her story reinforced why our fight mattered. We'd prevented future students from experiencing what Aisha had endured. We'd broken the cycle. The district's investigation concluded faster than expected. The final report was even more damaging than we'd anticipated. They'd found evidence of discrimination spanning Mrs. Kowalczyk's entire career at Lincoln High. Hundreds of students had been affected to varying degrees. Dr. Thompson personally delivered the findings to our group. The district would be implementing sweeping changes. Beyond the new policies already announced, they were establishing a retroactive grade review process for any former student who felt they'd been unfairly graded. The financial implications were staggering. The district faced potential liability for scholarship losses, college admission impacts, and emotional distress. Legal counsel was already preparing for possible lawsuits from affected families. Mrs. Kowalczyk's teaching license was under review by the state board. The district had forwarded all documentation to ensure she couldn't simply move to another area and continue teaching. Her actions had consequences beyond just losing one job. Our group met to discuss these developments. The atmosphere was subdued rather than celebratory. We'd won, but the victory felt complicated. Seeing the full scope of damage she'd caused over the years was sobering. Nguyen's parents had connected with other affected families from previous years. They were organizing support for students whose college paths had been altered by Mrs. Kowalczyk's discrimination. Some were exploring legal options for compensation. The new policies took effect immediately. Teachers attended mandatory workshops on cultural sensitivity and unconscious bias. The grade review process became more transparent, with clear appeals procedures. Student voices carried more weight in addressing concerns. Ms. Hart Rivera was offered the permanent position. She accepted enthusiastically, bringing fresh energy to the history department. Her first official act was creating a pronunciation guide for every student's name, which she practiced until perfect. Our class dynamics shifted too. Students who'd been silent before began participating more. The atmosphere of fear and judgment had dissipated. We could focus on actually learning history rather than navigating a minefield of potential humiliation. College application season continued amid these changes. My recovered grades strengthened my application significantly. The experience also gave me powerful essay material about standing up to injustice and the importance of collective action. Other teachers began reaching out privately, sharing their own observations about Mrs. Kowalczyk's behavior over the years. Many had suspected something was wrong but hadn't known how to address it. The teachers' union had made previous complaints difficult to pursue. The ripple effects continued spreading. Other schools in the district began examining their own grading practices and teacher conduct more closely. Nobody wanted to be the next Lincoln High, dealing with scandal and liability. Our documentation system became a model for other student groups facing similar issues. Siobhan created a template that could be adapted for different situations. The emphasis on meticulous record-keeping and collective action resonated widely. Local community organizations took notice too. The Hispanic Community Center invited me to speak about our experience. The Asian American Alliance featured our story in their newsletter. Our fight had touched something deeper than just grades. Mrs. Kowalczyk's house went up for sale 3 months later. A neighbor mentioned seeing moving trucks. She was leaving the area entirely, starting over somewhere else. Her reputation in educational circles was permanently damaged. I sometimes wondered what she was thinking during those final days. Did she recognize the harm she'd caused? Did she understand why we'd fought back? Or did she still believe she was the victim, unfairly targeted for maintaining standards? The answer came indirectly through her lawyer. The district received a letter suggesting potential counteraction for defamation and wrongful termination. The threat evaporated quickly when administrators responded with the full documentation of her discriminatory conduct. Spring semester brought a sense of normalcy we hadn't experienced all year. Ms. Rivera proved to be an excellent teacher, challenging us academically while respecting us as individuals. AP exam preparation intensified, but without the underlying stress of unfair treatment. Our group's bond had evolved from shared struggle to genuine friendship. We studied together, celebrated acceptances to various colleges, and supported each other through rejections. The experience had taught us valuable lessons about solidarity and persistence. Graduation approached with bittersweet feelings. We'd won an important victory, but the cost had been significant. Stress, anxiety, and academic disruption had marked our junior year. Still, we'd emerged stronger and more aware of our power to create change. The district published a final report on the incident, anonymizing details but acknowledging systemic failures that allowed discrimination to persist for years. They committed to ongoing reforms and regular reviews to prevent similar situations. Other students began approaching us with different issues they'd noticed but felt powerless to address. We shared our strategies and encouraged them to document everything. Change happened slowly, but our success had opened doors for others to walk through. Ms. Rivera incorporated our story into her curriculum, using it as a case study for civil rights and collective action. Future students would learn about the importance of standing up against discrimination, using our experience as a real-world example. The summer after graduation brought reflection and preparation for college. I'd been accepted to my top-choice school with a partial scholarship. The grades Mrs. Kowalczyk had tried to sabotage hadn't derailed my future after all. At our last gathering, before everyone scattered to different colleges, we talked about the lasting impact of our experience. We'd learned that authority figures weren't always right, that documentation was powerful, and that collective action could overcome individual powerlessness. Siobhan was heading to law school eventually, inspired by seeing how legal frameworks could protect student rights. Nguyen planned to study education, wanting to become the kind of teacher we'd needed. Saoirse was pursuing journalism, drawn to investigating and exposing injustice. My own path led toward public policy, focused on educational equity. The experience with Mrs. Kowalczyk had shown me how systems could fail vulnerable students. I wanted to help build better ones. As I packed for college, I found my folder of documentation from our fight. The papers felt heavy with significance. Evidence of discrimination, but also proof of our resilience. I decided to keep them, a reminder of what we'd accomplished together. The final district report arrived in late July. Mrs. Kowalczyk's teaching license had been permanently revoked by the state board. She was barred from working in education anywhere in the state. The decision cited persistent discriminatory conduct and abuse of authority. I thought about all the future students who would never have to endure her mispronunciations, her condescension, her weaponized grading. They'd never know what we'd prevented, but they'd benefit from our struggle nonetheless. 5 months later, and Mrs. K's house has a for sale sign. Guess she figured staying in town after becoming the poster child for how not to teach her wasn't the best career move. Our group chat remained active as we prepared for college. We shared packing lists, dorm assignments, and nervous excitement about the future. The bonds forged through adversity had become lasting friendships. On my last night before leaving for college, I wrote a letter to future Lincoln High students. I shared our story and encouraged them to speak up against injustice. Ms. Rivera promised to keep it in her classroom, part of the legacy we'd created. The next morning, as my parents drove me to college, we passed Lincoln High. The building looked the same from outside, but I knew it had changed internally. We'd left it better than we'd found it. Starting college felt like closing one chapter and opening another. The confidence gained from successfully challenging Mrs. Kowalczyk carried forward. I knew I could stand up for myself and others when necessary. During freshman orientation, I met another student who'd faced similar discrimination at her high school. We bonded over shared experiences and discussed how to remain vigilant against prejudice in new environments. My name was still occasionally mispronounced by professors and classmates, but now I corrected them immediately and firmly. The difference was their response, apologetic and willing to learn. Respect was the default, not the exception. Looking forward, I knew our story would continue rippling outward. Every student who felt empowered to speak up, every teacher who examined their own biases, every policy change to protect vulnerable students, all of it traced back to that moment when we decided enough was enough. Mrs. Kowalczyk had taught us something valuable after all, though not what she'd intended. She'd taught us that no one's authority was absolute, that discrimination could be disguised as standards, and that collective action could topple even entrenched power. Most importantly, she'd taught us that our names mattered. They carried our identities, our histories, our cultures. They deserved to be spoken with respect and care, and we deserved to be seen, heard, and valued for who we truly were. The girl who'd stood up in that classroom, voice shaking but determined, had grown into someone who understood her own power, someone who knew that change was possible, even when facing seemingly insurmountable authority. As I settled into my dorm room, unpacking boxes and arranging my new space, I placed that folder of documentation in my desk drawer, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof of what we could accomplish when we refused to accept injustice. The story we'd written together at Lincoln High was complete, but its impact would continue. Future students would walk those hallways with their names pronounced correctly, their identities respected, their grades fairly earned, and somewhere, in a classroom where Ms. Rivera now taught, a new attendance sheet would be filled out with careful attention to every syllable, every accent, every cultural nuance, because names mattered, because students mattered, because we had made sure they always would. Thanks for reading this story with me. If you want me to find more stories like this, subscribe.